The Man Who Changed Music, a radio portrait of Arnold Schoenberg. As part of CBC Wednesday Night, we bring you a special 2-hour documentary on the life and work of one of the great musical figures of our time, prepared and presented by Glenn Gould.
While it is still impossible to form a proper evaluation of Schoenberg's role in musical history, it seems to me that since his death in 1951, his immense contribution to the development of music in our time has slowly but surely been winning wider recognition. Nevertheless, apart from a mere handful of works, his music is relatively inaccessible to the public of today. In tonight's program, therefore, we shall not attempt to arrive at any sort of historical judgment. Rather, our purpose will simply be to explore a few of his compositions, to examine what appear to be certain misconceptions and contradictions surrounding both the man and his music. In short, to try to gain a clearer picture of a truly amazing musical personality.
Arnold Schoenberg, the man who changed music.
I cannot imagine music in the 20th century without Arnold Schoenberg. He seems to me to be the one indispensable musician of our time. I suppose that one can support the arguments in favor of his having been indispensable rather more easily than one can support the arguments for his having been great. But this does not at all mean that, in my opinion, he was not a great composer. To be honest, I think that in our century, only two men, Schoenberg and Richard Strauss, could be truly deserving of the title giant. It's true, though, that Schoenberg suffered a great deal from the confusion between the theories that he attempted to substantiate and his actual work as a composer. There have been only a few other figures in musical history whose historical position has been so fortunate, or unfortunate, if you will, that it's made difficult for many generations after their own time an honest and objective judgment of their output. I suspect that Schoenberg, like Monteverdi, like Gesualdo, in a way one might say even like Sebastian Bach, will be one of these composers. And I think it's most unlikely that we can expect to clarify all of the confusions surrounding the work of Arnold Schoenberg for many years to come. In fact, it would be rather presumptuous of me to offer anything more on this occasion than an attempt at the validation of my own reactions to his work. Schoenberg was well aware of this confusion which surrounded his work, and when he spoke of it, he was, in his quiet way, rather angry about it, for he regarded himself simply as a composer. He believed that whatever formulations he developed as a composer pertained only to those compositions. Contrary to most opinion today, there existed rather less of the dogmatist in Schoenberg than might be imagined. He was not by any means the all-persuasive propagandist who attempted to coerce associates and admirers into believing wholly in the technical manifestations of his own work, but he did long for the day when they would believe in the work itself.
I wonder sometimes who I am. When the Committee on Lectures and Drama announced my lecture, someone was afraid the readers might not know who I am. So they informed them as follows. A famous theoretician and controversial musical figure known for the influence he is proud to bear on modern music. Up to now, I thought I composed for different reasons.
It may be that Schoenberg was not altogether unjustified in fearing that he would be remembered primarily for the technical solutions which he offered to some of the thorniest musical problems of our time. Indeed, we already seem to be entering upon a period in which, though the name of Arnold Schoenberg is known more and more widely, He is, in fact, almost as frequent a drawing room reference as Freud or as Kafka, or if you happen to be in a particularly one-up drawing room, Kierkegaard. And yet, many people remark that the works of Schoenberg, except maybe for a few of his docile early compositions, are those which mark particularly significant transitional stages in his development, have so far failed to attract any large share of public attention. What makes it so difficult to know about Schoenberg, to know clearly what the future will hold for him, is the fact that this man's life, which encompasses approximately 50 years of important creative effort, takes place during a moment of transition for music, a moment of transition as profound and as inevitable, perhaps, as that which took place toward the end of the 16th century, in the days when the fantastic complications of modal technique were being overlapped and replaced by the simplifications of the system which we came to call tonality, the system upon which all important Western music of the past 300 years is built. Schoenberg stands at a moment of time in which the musical problems would seem to be not so very different from those which confronted the generation of Gibbons in England, of Sweelinck in the Netherlands, of Monteverdi in Italy. Theirs was the generation which, to varying degrees, sensed the responsibility of clarifying into what could be called a public common language the alternatives and mysteries of modal technique. In point of fact, as we all know, all art is mysterious, and hence the clarification is only a relative process. But it did happen that by the early years of the 17th century, we were presented with the first viable indications that the movement of triadic harmony, upon which all part music of the Renaissance had been based, could function in something approaching a reasonably well-defined relationship, a relationship in which the proprieties of chord movement would be determined by something resembling the force of gravity. There would be in this new music a centrifugal force which would link all harmonic units into a kind of preferential order. This is not to say that gravity, in the sense of a noticeable resolution for a noticeable tension, did not previously exist. Of course it did. But it existed with so many alternatives available, so many enharmonic practices which could abort the flow of triadic resolution, so many intrafraternal rules and regulations, so many codes of the secret lodge of musicians, of which the general public could not know, that music of the High Renaissance was an inordinately complicated and legislated affair. And strangely, it was this new music of the 17th century which seemed, or at any rate which seems by comparison, music of great simplicity and forthrightness, of public as opposed to private character. Well, Schoenberg, in my opinion, stands at a rather analogous moment in history, for despite all of the talk which we hear today of the complications of his technique, the ruthless organization of materials which he's supposed to have advocated, his music stands essentially as an infinitely simpler manifestation of art than does the music of the romantic Wagnerian tradition out of which Schoenberg sprang. This will probably seem a very odd statement, but I think it is true. And admitting that it is true does not necessarily admit that music which is simpler is less inherently interesting. It would be virtually impossible to expect that an idiom or a vocabulary as new as that in which Schoenberg chose to communicate his thoughts to us could be other than a simplification of the immensely complex cross-referenced language which preceded it. The language that Schoenberg inherited, the language of Wagner, of Brahms, of Strauss and Mahler, that's an immensely complicated language. It's a language in which one wonders what greater intensities can possibly be drawn from its vocabulary, in which one gasps as each work seeks to overwhelm one with the effect of an emotional jolt greater than that which preceded it. This is a complicated language. It's a language, moreover, which rides upon the rules of about 300 years of musical technique, a constantly evolving technique, to be sure, but a technique which was fundamentally based upon certain common experiences of controlling a rationale of movement through this particular gravity of chords, a language which, as it grew older, as the 17th century gave way to the 18th and the 18th to the 19th, underwent many practices which gradually clarified or crystallized its usage, but which primarily became more expressive, more aware of its potential, more complicated in the true sense of the word. And as it grew older and more familiar, its practitioners discovered that all that was left to add to this language was the abortive gesture, the deliberate slackening of discipline, the willingness to do for an expressive reason the wrong thing. And so Schoenberg comes upon the scene of music at a time when such fantastic complication existed, if you accept my definition of complexity, that his primary reaction to the turn of the century world of music was to organize, to rationalize, to intellectualize its relations, to make outward what had to a degree been inward. Now, if Schoenberg did that, and only that, one could perhaps conclude that Schoenberg was an unsubtle man, a man who did not appreciate the complex involutions of musical meaning, and who is determined to make understandable those things which are incapable of being completely understood, to legislate those things which cannot ever be governed. But what must be remembered about Schoenberg and his historical position is that there was an organic disorder which compromised the health of tonality in his day, and it was, of course, due to this fantastic complexity of the vocabulary which he'd inherited, due to the many levels of relationship in musical structure that now existed, that initial simplicity, which was the founding purpose of tonality, became distorted and unbalanced by the presence of what we call a chromatic extension of the tonal vocabulary, that those liberties engendered by tonality in its late stages weakened with every pursuance of an expressive purpose the fundamental tenets of the tonal philosophy. Let's consider for a moment a work like Richard Strauss' Ein Heldenleben. Here is a piece of approximately 50 minutes in length. It's in one movement, which is only to say that it moves continuously without any pause. And it encompasses a range of expression of musical allegory, if you will, in this case, which would be virtually unthinkable in any other vocabulary but that of the highly chromatic one in which Strauss operates. But for all that it covers so much ground, that it points to so many possibilities, it must be remembered that this scope, this vast canvas, is also an enormous liability. It's very difficult to make with that vocabulary the quick thrust, the indisputable musical statement. There's nothing about Strauss' vocabulary which permits him to do what Beethoven of the Last Quartets could do in half a phrase. But such was the nature of tonality that each time a more distant relationship was encountered and admitted to the tonal orbit, all of the more fundamental relationships became challenged and had to be artificially strengthened accordingly. The essence of the matter is that the time, the leisure, if you will, had to be available to seek out the variegated relationships near and distant of this fantastically complicated language. So these were the twilight years of tonality, years of a warm and expressive language, but a language which was dying. And as with some who are about to die, it possessed an incredibly beautiful, feverishly transcendent glow. Now Schoenberg inherited and accepted the challenge of this language, for there was nothing of the anarchist in his makeup. He loved the language which he had inherited too dearly to destroy it, and yet he realized with a clarity that few can claim to have possessed the basic fact of its evolution. Evolution is the key to a consideration of Arnold Schoenberg, because all of his theories about music and all of his faith about his own participation in history hinge upon the manner in which he interpreted the evolution of music. To Schoenberg, and indeed to many other people as well, all history of art is evolution. This is not to say that with hindsight it evolves, because actually with hindsight almost anything can be made to seem to evolve. It's rather to say that for a man of Schoenberg's temperament, the sense of destiny, of his own participation in history, is bound to an idea that in most cases there is an historically justified line of procedure, and that all other directions at any given time, though fascinating and entertaining and worthwhile and even to a degree influential, are basically beside the point. Schoenberg, it must be remembered, was an Austrian, and of course a more infuriating breed of music-loving people does not exist. To the Austrian, it's the Central European symphonic tradition which has indisputably governed the world of music for 200 years at least, and around which all other developments may be counted as fringe benefits. And so, to an Austrian of the post-Wagnerian years, it's easy to understand why the destiny of music would seem to be right in the hands of his generation, why the solution to the thickening dilemma of chromatic harmony and its motivic implications would be undeniably his to find. It might also be remembered that in this context, even at that other turning point, the year 1600, though German culture was by no means in those days the guiding post that it was in 1900, that even then, among the first to sense the purifying, public demonstrative aspect of the new language of tonality were the Germans. Compare the hearty stability of a Lutheran chorale with the French part song of the same period, and you'll see what I mean. There is something in the German, or to be more inclusive, the Austro-German temperament, which is at once explorative and stable, analytical and instinctive, daring and conservative. Above all, there's the ability to be organized and coherent and as logical as can be, and to find amidst the creation of the most complex rhetoric the vitality, the peasant-like joy of that rhetoric. There is, in this temperament, a desire to effect a conciliation between the needs of the future and reverence for the past. There's a great reluctance to give up that which has been thought worthy of high esteem and which has played a significant part in one's development. And hence the sense of evolution, as Schoenberg meant it, the sense of continuation, of extension, applies to his music and to his life in a rather special way. For Schoenberg was perhaps the most conservative radical who ever lived. At no time in his life did he express either dissatisfaction or disaffection with the tradition which he'd inherited. At no time did he set out to do less than honor to that tradition. As a tonal composer, as a man working primarily, although with rapidly changing emphasis, within the folds of a defined and definable key relation, Schoenberg contributed, in my opinion, some of the most glorious music of the early 20th century. His work within tonality in that period spans approximately 12 years, if one begins to date it from the advent of his first characteristically Wagnerian leader, and it counts up to the last of those works which are unmistakably unified by a responsibility to a single tonal identification. Ironically, it's the first major work of this period, and hence the first major work which Schoenberg ever wrote, the Sextet Verklärte Nacht, which has remained after 60 years the only really popular work of Schoenberg's, the only work, to state it very bluntly, which is any kind of box office attraction on a program today. And what is so ironical about this, and what annoyed Schoenberg so much about it, is the fact that while Verklärte Nacht is indeed a lovely and gracious and beautifully worked out composition, it's the one of his early works which exhibits least the real character of Schoenberg. It accepts, without much question, the basic vocabulary of the late Wagnerian years, and except for an unusually lively and well-integrated inner voice structure, and at times a particularly wide-ranging bass line, there's really nothing about it which more than hints at the way things were actually going for Arnold Schoenberg.
In my Verklärte Nacht, Transfigured Night, the thematic construction is based on Wagnerian model and sequence. Above a roving harmony on the one hand, and on Brahms' technique of, as I call it, of developing variation on the other hand. At this time, I had already become an admirer of Richard Strauss, but not yet of Gustav Mahler, whom I started to understand only much later, at a time when his symphonic style could no more exert its influence on me. But it is still possible that his strongly tonal structure and his more sustained harmony influenced me considerably. There were not many unusual melodic progressions requesting clarification through the harmony.
Another odd thing about Verklärte Nacht is that it relies very heavily upon what was called in the Victorian era a program, an extra musical reference to a printed text. Appended to it in its first printing was a rather weepily romantic poem by Richard Demel, which tells about the plight of a lady who is, as they say, up the creek. In the course of the poem, which is quite a short one, fortunately, she pours out her heart to the gentleman whom she's betrayed, and at poem's end, or at any rate at the end of the sextet, they wander off into the moonlight with the firm intention of getting churched in D major. Schoenberg was only 25 when he wrote Verkletternacht, and it's really not surprising to find him sharing the enthusiasm of his own generation for the interplay of literary suggestion and musical form. This sort of thing, which was much more common than we now realize, was exactly the premise which allowed the tone poems of Richard Strauss to form a satisfactory conception in Strauss' mind. It has, however, very little to do with the effect of the tone poems upon our ears. But that whole generation of the German post-romantics were concerned about making an interplay between musical and literary architecture. From the opposite side of the fence, we have Thomas Mann attempting to apply the abstractions of a sonata allegro to his lovely early novelette, Tonio Krüger. Really, what it reveals is not so much the promise of the Wagnerian art amalgam theory, but rather the genuine desperation that lay at the heart of so much of the musical problem of that day. These textual references, no matter how little we care about them, provided for the composer a kind of signpost that could be followed conceptually, something to grab hold of in this idiom which allowed too much luxury, which partook of too much abundance. In this period, which includes Verkletternacht, the symphonic poem Pelléas and Mélisande, the first two string quartets, and the E major chamber symphony, Schoenberg is, in my opinion, a complete master of the late Romantic language, a language which he uses here in a most personal and intellectualized way. But not everyone agrees. The critic Winthrop Sargent, for instance, believes that even the early Schoenberg was a minor figure in a post-Wagnerian world.
Well, whether a man is major or minor, I mean, one has, how major and how minor. I don't think that the early Schoenberg, and by this I really mean the Schoenberg of Gurrelieder and Verkletternacht, in other words, the completely tonal and rather Wagnerian works, was a not too original and rather weak composer. His work, in the first place, was quite derivative from Wagner. It isn't so much a matter of the technique; it's a matter of what the music conveys. And Verkletternacht, for example, to me, is a very pleasant composition to listen to, but I wouldn't put it on a par with a symphony of Gustav Mahler's, for example. Nor would I put Gurrelieder in that position. I've listened to it several times. At first I was very impressed by it, and later on I began to think, well, it's a little bit weak and unoriginal.
In comparison with Verkletternacht, the Kammersymphony, Opus 9, is a work of incredible power and drive, a work which is controlled by a wonderfully firm hand. As Verkletternacht is rhapsodic and whimsical, languid and sequential, so the Kammersymphony is tight and driven, functional and classical. Its outline is that of the classical symphony of 4 movements, but truncated into one long movement, the final section being, in effect, a summing up of all the thematic material of the work, and a partial recapitulation of the opening section as well. The tonality is nominally that of E major, but the chromatic manipulation is really quite different than that of Verkletternacht, because here Schoenberg is examining the consequences of relating to a primary triadic formation dissonantly conceived chordal progressions. The point is, however, that he still relates them, that when we hear this 4th chord progression, for instance, we hear it not only as a strangely dissonant unit, but as a harmonic substance which bears a fundamental genetical relationship to its subsequent, if complicated, resolution into the tonic. But this was an enormous step forward for Schoenberg, because previously his sense of the emancipation of dissonance was largely concerned with the concept of ambiguity, of indecision, of stating so many chromatic factors that the primary tonality became distended almost beyond recognition. Here, however, we're really more aware at times of E major than we were of D minor in Verklärte Nacht. But nevertheless, we've come with the Kammer Symphony very much closer to an autonomy of dissonance.
The climax of my first period is definitely reached in Kammer Symphony Opus 9. I was at this time able to write a theme which I thought not to be related to the main theme, but nevertheless it seemed so logical to me that I didn't cross it out. And as I said, years later, I found the solution in that I saw the relation. And I say, if there is a composer capable of inventing things on the basis of such a remote relationship, I am not one of them.
This period ends with the composition of the second string quartet, Opus 10, which dates from the year 1908, and which introduces in its last movement a texture of such romantic expansion, such wildly leaping ninths and sevenths, that it can no longer be said to partake seriously of any responsibility to a coordinated tonal center. As a matter of fact, there's a bit of a shock inherent in this work, and really not one about which I'm entirely convinced organically. There seems to me to be a little something of the gimmick about the introduction of his first tonal work within a composition which in its other three movements is related entirely to a tonality of F sharp. There is, however, significantly enough attached to this last movement, a vocal part for soprano with the rather illuminating text from Stefan Georg. I feel the breath of other planets blowing. more specifically with the last movement of that quartet, Schoenberg moved into the world of atonality, and with the exception of a few works written during his American residence in the 1930s and 40s, he never again composed within a conventional tonal discipline. There must have been a strange stirring abroad in the world of 1908, 1909, because certainly Schoenberg, though he was an intrepid explorer of musical possibility, was by no means the only composer who sensed this disintegration of the tonal vocabulary. Or if he was the only composer who did sense it, then his influence and sense of conviction must have been so overwhelming upon such men as Anton Webern and Alban Berg that they too were within a year pursuing their musical destinies in the same direction as Schoenberg's recourse to pure dissonance. But there was even more to it than that. This was the same time, in fact it was almost the same year, in which Wassily Kandinsky painted the first of his improvisations series, which were to make as influential a break with representational art as did Schoenberg's atonality with tonal music. It is indeed uncanny the way in which the visual arts paralleled the development of atonal music at this time, and particularly the way in which they joined with atonal music in moving toward a purpose which could be described superficially as total abstraction in the years immediately preceding the First World War. It's often been pointed out by critics of this new music that the error of such a profound change is that it does not evolve as language does, slowly, functionally, within the common reference of the public. It's perfectly true that various devices of contemporary poetry approximate to some degree the calibration of the world of serial technique, but by and large, and not even excepting the last works of James Joyce, there's been no fundamental change in the nature of literary materials. There's been no sense of divorce between the writer and the reading public, as there would seem to have been between the musician and his audience. And herein, it seems to me, lies one of the major clues to the nature of this transition which occurred. Namely, that insofar as the most serious constructive efforts, such as those of a Schoenberg or of a Kandinsky, are concerned, there's no fundamental change in the attempt at communication that's been evolved. It's simply that music, in all forms, in all periods, is an art of total abstraction, is not an art which is fundamentally allegorical, except perhaps in the highest metaphysical sense, and that it does not, and has not, with very few exceptions, pretended to be other than a means of expressing the mysteries of communication in a form which is equally mysterious. If my explanation of the relativity of atonality is to be accepted, I suppose that it must necessarily exclude many of the comments which have been made about the derivation of atonality, particularly those which are concerned with the significance of its having first appeared in the turbulent years immediately preceding the First World War. I don't believe that the undeniable state of chaos in the world of those days had very much to do with the artistic function of atonality, or of abstraction in art for that matter, if only for the reason that not all human beings are equally moved, or at any rate moved in the same direction, by the events and tensions of their own time. If we feel, for instance, that the inevitable expression of the turbulence and chaos of World War I was depicted in a disintegration of tonality, then how can we possibly explain that another master like Richard Strauss saw nothing inconsistent in retaining the practices and boundaries of tonality, and not only that, but indeed during those very years of war, in writing the Opera Die Frau ohne Schatten, a work which not only accepts a frame of harmonic reference more restricted than that of his previous Electra or Salome, but deals in its plot with a sort of unworldly allegory, such as would make the complexities of Parsifal seem child's play. Nor should we over-dramatize, I think, the shattering blow which came at that time to the comfortable world of the Edwardians. The world knew what suffering could mean long before the days of Kaiser Wilhelm. And again, the reaction to pain, to suffering, is such a personal thing. It doesn't necessarily entail the dissipation of order. It can be depicted by an attempt to invoke an artistic order, to compensate for distress. Schoenberg, for instance, didn't suffer more as a man than did Mahler, and yet Mahler, in his moments of most excruciating sorrow, is driven to the kind of tonal simplicity which, in his view, meant a transcendence of the world's problems. So it seems to me to be a great mistake to read into the fantastic transition of music in our time a total social significance. Undeniably, there do exist correlations between the developments of a social stratum and the art which grows up around it, just as the public manner of early Baroque music rests to some degree upon the development in Europe of a merchant class in the late 16th century. But it's terribly dangerous, I think, to advance a complicated social argument for a change which is fundamentally a procedural one within the operative scope of artistic discipline. In the music that Schoenberg wrote between the second string quartet of 1908 and the beginning of the First World War, there are still, as one might expect, a good many vestiges of key relation. But these vestiges now have the nostalgia that we associate with the reminiscence of a bygone and much-loved period.
The first step occurred in the songs Opus 14, and thereafter in the 15 songs of the Hanging Garden and the 3 piano pieces, Opus 11. Most critics of this new style failed to investigate up to which degree the ancient eternal laws of musical aesthetic were observed, spurned, or merely adjusted to changed circumstances. Such superficiality brought about these accusations of anarchy and revolution, while it was distinctly evolution, no more exorbitant than that which always has occurred in the history of music.
Evolution. Listen, for instance, to this passage from the second of the piano pieces, Opus 11, in which, if I'm not mistaken, you'll detect a very distant reminiscence of the key of D minor. In that example, the nature of the D minor reminiscence is largely confined to the alternation of the bass notes D and F, and since it's by no means a particularly successful composition, one could conclude from it that there was, in the device of constant reiteration, a measure of desperation, a determination to hold as long as possible to some central source of reference. Here, on the other hand, is another brief excerpt which coincidentally also suggests D minor. It is from the Opus 15, Songs of the Hanging Gardens, but notice how much more subtle and varied the harmonic implications of this song. In other words, in this music there still exists to a degree an order of preference, a process of selection, determined by the faint reminiscence of tonal chromatic procedures. There does not, in the sense that we now use the word, exist atonality. But listen to this brief example from Schoenberg's Opus 19, and in it, unless you read in references which convey, as they say, different things to different people, you'll not likely detect any real tonal center. The only difference in that example, which we just played from Schoenberg's 6 piano pieces, Opus 19, is that that brief instant of music, all 21 seconds of it, constitutes an entire bagatelle. Indeed, all 6 of the Opus 19 require not more than 5 minutes for performance. Can you imagine the sense of horrifying change which must have occurred in the world of Arnold Schoenberg? A change that would make the man who wrote Gererlieder and Pelléas and Mélisande 10 years earlier confine himself now to the activity of writing tiny pieces for the piano. Not that there's anything wrong with writing tiny pieces for the piano, but these small pieces tell us more about the fundamental desperation of Schoenberg's position in 1911 or 1912 than any words could do. Here he was committing himself to a language which he did not know, a language which he had no means to govern except that of his innate musicality. What a temptation it must have been to return to the solid ground that supported him only a few years before. Of course, it would be a loss of face. His pupils who had committed themselves to this language as well might look elsewhere for inspiration, but it would be safer. He could once again compete on more or less equal terms with men like Max Reger or Richard Strauss. But of course, this did not, I suppose, could not happen. For Schoenberg was a man possessed by the determination to stand or fall by the path which he'd set for himself. And even if following that path meant confining the energies of his musical craft to minutiae for the piano, this too could be borne. Someone once rather kindly remarked of these small pieces that they managed to compress a novel into a sigh. problem which faced Schoenberg was to decide in what way this void of dissonance which he'd created for himself could be organized, in what way it could be manipulated in a more meaningful manner. There were so many ways in which things could go in this strange new world of dissonance. Was one way necessarily more meaningful than the next? Schoenberg logically deduced that if it was the vast expanse of chromatic harmony which had launched him into the atonal orbit, and if in turn it was the elongated, writhing, melodic manner of the post-Wagnerians which had been the cause of having arrived at this extensive chromatic vocabulary, then perhaps it was this very melodic manner, this superchromatic phrase structure, which provided the clue to organizing the universe of atonality. Would it not be possible, he thought, to build motives of such length and endurance that they would provide within themselves the nucleus of many other motives which would relate to them, and perhaps give a clue as well to the sense of proportionate relation between the various structural components? But nothing in Schoenberg's background equipped him for this challenge, because although he had a great deal of experience in creating those long-limbed melodic figures which his generation found so alluring, he'd always conceived of them as existing entirely within a harmonic reference which, though it might be greatly extended and modulative because of them, was nonetheless triadic in concept. And as we've seen, the first step in determining a sense of harmonic values independent of tonality came with works like the Kammersymphony, which exhibited in that celebrated instance of the fourth chord, which we heard a few minutes ago, an autonomy of dissonance, which was, if only for a moment, two-dimensional. Removed from its harmonic obligation to resolve, a dissonant unit like a fourth chord could provide in more or less equal measure both a melodic and a harmonic, a horizontal and a vertical unity. So Schoenberg, at the time when he'd broken away from tonal composition, was faced with trying to construct a whole system of harmony independent of a tonal center, in which a relativity of chords would exist, a relativity based on the greater or lesser degree of dissonance which they contained, and, most important, on the degree to which, as in that fourth chord example, he could reasonably expect to persuade the interval units of his themes, his motives, to separate intelligibly in a vertical manner as well. The first part of this problem was a lot simpler to solve than the second part. It was much easier to create a certain relativity of chord tension than to do this while maintaining the interval link between horizontal units and their harmonic emanations. It should be remembered, however, that it is rather more difficult, particularly with the full-blooded texture of Schoenberg's instrumental and orchestral thinking of that day, to avoid the implication of a triadic source. We humans, as Mr. Freud pointed out to us, are notorious for our ability to associate, even when the association is nothing more than the webs that dreams are made of. And it's difficult to listen to the Schoenberg of that period without writing in triadic connotations, which he really didn't intend to imply at all. Within the aesthetic which Schoenberg employed, the sentiment which governed the spirit of his work more genuinely than any other was the insistence upon regarding a work of art as a totally comprehensible, unified object. No concept has caused greater confusion or opened Schoenberg's arguments to wider challenge, because the question which governs all art is to what degree is it accidental, to what degree is it entirely worked out before the fact. Schoenberg was well aware that both these questions were essentially mysteries which must go lacking an answer, and which can at best be expected to hold a relative answer for any one creative person. But his own persuasion lay in acknowledging a conception before the fact, in which from a certain embryonic cell which represented itself as the governing and propelling factor in the creative judgment, the work of art would spring. It was most significant that the more Schoenberg grasped this concept, the less he wrote. There was something almost nullifying about its magnitude. In fact, for almost 10 years, Schoenberg, except for dallying with his never-to-be-finished oratorio, Jacob's Ladder, wrote almost nothing at all. Perhaps he had come too far. Perhaps no man could encompass within a lifetime such an enormous transition. These were the silent years for Arnold Schoenberg. And for a creative man, the silent years are usually years of despair. Eventually, after this long period of thought and of silence, Schoenberg formulated the theory of composition which has since made his name the most frequent target of the critics of contemporary music. It brought him under a degree of fire which made the criticism of his early atonal work seem like the harmless spray of a child's water pistol, for now Schoenberg was not simply asserting his own right to wander in the strange world of atonality. He was suggesting that there was an application of logic of which this world deserved to know, a logic which would justify the use of total dissonance, and suggesting, moreover, that this organization of atonality, which he now conceived and advocated, could apply not only to his own music, but to all other music composed within that vocabulary. This governing organization was what became known as the 12-tone technique.
In 1915, I had sketched a symphony, the scherzo of which accidentally consisted of 12 tones. Only 2 years later, a further step in this direction occurred. I had planned to build all the main themes of my unfinished oratorio, the Jakobsleiter, out of 6 tones. I called this working with the tones, not yet 12 tones. I had at this time not discovered all the technical tools which furnish such abundance of variety as is necessary for expansive forms.
At first, this system seemed not only perverse and arbitrary, it seemed almost laughably naive, for its underlying premise was that this embryonic cell, the tone row, would not itself necessarily be part of the work. Though it might be applied literally as a melodic unit on occasion, it would essentially stand aloof from the work and simply be the source of reference to which the composer's invention would be applied. But it would not be part of the work the way the keel of a ship is part of that ship. It would lie like some mysterious unborn specimen upon the composer's writing table, and from it, by contemplating and pondering it, by inventing certain numbers of permutational variations upon it, the work, as a series of variative ideas, would spring forth. The 12 tones of the tone row, or the tone series, or the Grundgestalt, as Schoenberg called it, and which were, of course, the 12 tones of the chromatic scale, were to appear in a constant sequence which could be varied in posture but not in substance by transposing the set and having it begin on some of the other notes of the chromatic scale. But once the initial tone had made its appearance, it could not depart the scene without having brought with it all 11 of its relatives, nor could it, in the particularly authoritarian manner with which Schoenberg first conceived it, reassert within the context of one transposition an earlier member of the set, for fear that this would provide a kind of quasi-tonal reminiscence. Since the underlying premise of this kind of composition depends on employing a principle of constant variation, any of the primary forms indigenous to the total set were equally welcome. The inversion, that's the turning upside down, the retrogression, that's the proceeding from back to front, and the retrogressive inversion, or if you prefer, the inverted retrogression, which is, of course, oh, why don't I just leave that to your imagination? There are a few other principles of this kind, most of them equally arbitrary, and all of them designed to limit the chance aspect of composition. And Schoenberg, with the formulation of this strange new code, became, as you can imagine, the most hated, feared, laughed at, and very occasionally respected composer of his generation. But the odd thing about it was that with this oversimplified, exaggerated system, Schoenberg began to compose again. And not only did he begin to compose, he embarked upon a period of about 5 years, which contained some of the most beautiful, colorful, imaginative, fresh, inspired music which he ever wrote. Out of this concoction of childish mathematics and debatable historical perception came an intensity, a joie de vivre, which knows no parallel in Schoenberg's life. How could this be, then? Of what strange alchemy was this man compounded that the sources of his inspiration flowed most freely when stemmed and checked by legislation of the most stifling kind? And odder still, what was the peculiar attraction of this system which took hold upon the imagination of men like Alban Berg and Anton Webern and made them mold it into a destiny so very different from that of Schoenberg? I suppose part of the answer lies in the fact that Schoenberg was always intrigued by numbers and afraid of numbers and attempting to read his destiny in numbers. And after all, what greater romance of numbers can there be than to govern one's creative life by them? And I suppose part of it was due to the fact that after 15 years awash in a sea of dissonance, Schoenberg felt himself to be on firm ground once again. Thirdly, part of it is certainly that all music must have a system, and that particularly in those moments of rebirth, such as Schoenberg had led us into, it's much more necessary to adhere to the system, to accept totally its consequences, than at a later, more mature stage of its existence. Since the system itself was so new, the formal aspect of Schoenberg's compositions at this time acquired, strangely for him in view of his basic 19th century mentality, an almost entirely 18th century foundation. The movements, still rather short ones, of these first 12 tone works take the form of gavottes, mousettes, gigues, of simple canons and mock violent preludes, of gentle intermezzi and jocular marches. That was the first movement of Schoenberg's Serenade, Opus 24, written in 1924, and a work which is only, as the initiate would have it, partly 12-tone. It is, however, one of the best examples of what this new discipline meant for Schoenberg. Like most of the other compositions of that period, which includes the septet, the piano suite, the woodwind quintet, and the third string quartet, it's stimulated by an extremely lyric touch, a delicious and for Schoenberg, rather surprising interest in delicate timbre. That was a mandolin and guitar which you heard in that piece, in addition to clarinets and string trio. And, in general, by a particularly joyous and airy control of sonority. The liaison between the arbitration of 12-tone theories and the compacted forms of the 18th century was a strange one, but an admirable one, for within the binary folds of these little dance movements lie some of the subtlest organizational premises of early tonality. And Schoenberg, without ever once suggesting tonality, suggests that unique sense of balance, of cadential propriety, and of modulated reintroduction of material, which gave the Baroque dance movements their unique poise. I think, eventually, this period of the early 12-tone works will be regarded, perhaps in addition to the tonal decade of 1900, as the most entirely happy and productive years of Schoenberg's life. It's true that they were years of conciliation, and that those approaches which he made toward a liaison of serial technique in the musical forms of the 18th century could not at best provide more than a passing haven. But imagine how thrilling it must have been to discover that there was a way to adapt the motivic scope of atonality and the licentious freedom of its harmonic possibilities within a familiar formal enterprise. It may also be that there was such a mating of conservative and radical in Schoenberg's disposition, that these two periods in his life were especially happy precisely because of that measure of conciliation, of amalgamation between those things which he dared to try and the reminiscence of those things which he dearly loved.